Big news from the FDA today. Pfizer's COVID vaccine became the first to receive full FDA approval. Until now, it had been approved only for emergency use. 60% of Americans are now fully vaccinated, and that number will likely increase with the FDA approval of Pfizer. But Delta cases are soaring, and the push to vaccinate more Americans remains intense. To talk about all of this and your concerns about Delta, kids going back to school, and more, I am so excited to be joined by Dr. Vin Gupta. You've probably seen Dr. Gupta a million times on television, but I will still give you his bio. He wears many hats. He's a pulmonary and critical care doctor in Seattle and a professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Dr. Gupta, thank you so much for your voice throughout this pandemic and for being here today.
Jessica, honored to be here. Thank you.
So the first question I want to ask is about FDA approval. I know some people will say, why did it take so long? And some people will say, why did it happen so fast? Can you explain why is it getting approval now?
Thanks for touching on this topic, because there's a lot of confusion out there when it comes to Operation Warp Speed and this notion that somehow the vaccines were fast-tracked and science was curbed. And the truth, Jessica, is that that couldn't be further from the truth. What happened with the development of Pfizer, Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, here stateside at least, is that all the chafe, all the bureaucracy that usually accompanies any vaccine development was instantly removed. So typically it takes months for vaccine trials to get funded from the NIH, from other sources. That time period got compressed down to zero. So there was no delays in cutting money from the government to fund these trials. So that's one reason why this process happened quickly. The second reason was it takes usually months, if not years, to actually enroll people into phase 1 to 3 clinical trials. Again, that time was compressed from months to years into days to weeks. And then ultimately getting people to say, yes, you can go from phase 1 to 2 to 3. That review process happened again on the order of weeks, not months and years. So the scientific process was accelerated because all the bureaucracy in between it was essentially eliminated. So we could do the same thing for flu, for other vaccines, if we remove the bureaucracy. We're not going to do that because those things don't cause pandemics. But that's the fundamental misunderstanding. When it comes to FDA approval, basically the same exact thing happened. Instead of waiting weeks and months and years to look at reams of data, they were forced to look at it more quickly. But we have 360 million data points here. So safety, effectiveness, process was not compromised.
They busted through red tape. It's the way we used to say it in Washington.
Exactly.
So Moderna and J&J have not yet received full approval. Do you have a sense why not or when that might happen?
Moderna's been tracking about a month in lag from Pfizer. So Pfizer's just been at the front of it from the very beginning. So expect Moderna around October 1st. Johnson & Johnson has been lagging for reasons, and I frequently talk to the company and their senior medical team for reasons that are a little head scratching, but they've had struggles talking about side effects. They've had struggles publishing data about what 2 doses of the J&J vaccine will mean versus 1. So they've been really lagging, broadly speaking, but expect their 1 shot to get approved by end of year. Expect data on 2 shots to be published in the next 2 weeks.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I'll come back to that when we talk about boosters. The full approval for the Pfizer vaccine is for kids 16 and over, but emergency use is still available for kids 12 and up. Can you explain this discrepancy, and should we interpret that to mean anything?
I don't think it means anything, practically speaking, when we're talking to people. And I think, frankly, a lot has been made about full approval, whereas I personally say we shouldn't make that big of a deal about it. Because if we do make a big deal about it, people are going to say, well, why were you pushing the vaccine for the first 9 months if suddenly today's a big day? 12 to 15, Jessica, it's purely about how many data points they have to evaluate effectiveness of the vaccine and safety in that age group. Once they cross that threshold, approval will follow. So this is, frankly, in some ways, the science is already there to issue the emergency use. Approval is about just meeting certain thresholds of having enough data to say, yes, let's go to full approval. And it's in some ways semantics.
Right. And sometimes it's hard to find kids to enroll, so it takes a little longer to just get that data. Is that Correct.
100,
Yeah.
that you nailed it. And that's why it's taking longer for 5 to 11 and even longer for less than 5.
Do you have a rough projection when parents would be able to vaccinate their younger kids?
Hopefully October 1st. So this was a key point here. Nobody really wanted to start giving a quote unquote emergency use, but not fully approved vaccine to those less than 12 years of age. It was just, there was a level of discomfort in the pediatric community. So now that this bridge has been crossed for Pfizer and soon for Moderna, expect that emergency use for 5 and up is going to follow in the weeks ahead, not months.
That's close. Okay, parents will be relieved to hear that. Let's talk a little bit about booster shots. Lots of questions from people who got Moderna and J&J asking should they get Pfizer, all the J&J asking if they should just get an mRNA vaccine. What's your view on mixing and matching vaccines?
That it's entirely safe. And then we need to be nimble here in the setting of an emergency, that if we're already talking, what confuses me and frankly angers me is that we're talking about third booster shots for everybody. If you got 2 shots of Pfizer and Moderna, and we're leaving 13 million people who got 1 shot J&J out in a lurch, that no, we still need to wait for the data. The data already exists, Jessica. With AstraZeneca, a sister vaccine to J&J, the Canadians, our friends in England, across North Africa and the Middle East, they're already mixing 1 shot AstraZeneca with the Pfizer Moderna vaccine as a second dose boost. What they're noticing is that fantastic levels of protection, almost equivalent to if you had gotten 2 shots of Pfizer and Moderna, very safe. Why we can't take that and say, if you want a second shot now, describing risks and benefits, of course, the 1 shot J&Jers, that if you want to take a second shot, you should be allowed to. We should have that nimbleness. We should not say we need to wait 6 to 8 months to complete our own clinical trial. It doesn't make sense. We have to be able to extrapolate and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. So it doesn't make a lot of sense that we're talking about third shots for otherwise healthy, less than 65-year-old individuals of a Pfizer or Moderna regimen, when the 1-shotters, for example, could easily get a second shot, in my view, from the science that exists today, much less our kids, much less those that are unvaccinated. And the risk, I think, that talking about third shots for the otherwise healthy crowd, less than 65, the risk that that's going to have in further causing questions and concerns amongst the unvaccinated, I think is quite high.
May I ask this? I didn't realize that. Are people who had the 1-shot J&J not yet approved for a booster of the mRNA?
No, they're not. It's wrong policy. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so it's been difficult. I firmly believe that if you got 1 shot of J&J, the science says it's safe and quite effective to get an mRNA shot. Dr. Fauci and others say we must do the clinical trial here in the US. We can't necessarily look to what's happening elsewhere.
Wow. Okay. Can you help people understand why is it at 8 months that the booster shot is recommended? Why not 6 or 10?
Well, data out of Israel, Jessica, showed that at 8 months, it looks like a protectiveness of the 2-shot regimen, if you got Pfizer and Moderna, was waning. Protectiveness against ending up in the hospital if you're exposed to Delta, and you're 65 and older, or have a high-risk medical condition like cancer. That if you're high risk, as defined by those 2 descriptions, that at around 8 months, you're losing that level of protectiveness against hospitalization that worries us. So for those individuals, and that's data from Israel, it makes sense to give a third shot. But we've long expected that if you're high risk or vulnerable based on age, you will need a boost. What doesn't make sense is that there is no data at this moment. I got my 2 shots 9 months ago. We're not seeing that for the otherwise healthy less than 65 crowd, that they're having waning protectiveness against the hospital. And so what now, prescribing boosters for all, when boosters for some, based on the data, make sense, all it does is it confuses people. It causes a lot of anxiety out there, and it makes us look terrible. When you think about global norms, when we think about vaccine equity, if there isn't a clear need based on the data to give boosters for all, we shouldn't be doing it.
But that is the policy soon, that boosters for all can come eventually.
Well, this is where there's a lot of controversy. And right. 2, I thought it was inappropriate that leading officials at HHS basically subverted and put into a corner the FDA and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which should be making that decision. Why the Surgeon General and others decided that they needed to come out on Thursday of last week and say, we strongly believe in this. Why they didn't defer quietly to the experts in the room is odd. So now they've painted those experts in a room in a corner that either they could publicly disagree or get behind a policy that does not make sense in terms of the data we have today.
Once approved, will you get a third shot?
I'm going to wait and see. And I think that if I'm going to publicly comment like this, I have to practice what I preach. So no, I will not. And there is not an epidemic, Jessica, let's be clear, of healthcare workers who received their vaccines 9 months ago ending up in the hospital. There is no real world evidence that if you're less than 65, otherwise healthy, you need a third shot. So I will not be right now.
So I got a lot of questions about this. Is there evidence of healthcare workers getting breakthrough? And all the data is showing that 98+% of hospitalized people, roughly, are the unvaccinated. But there's a story that's broken through this weekend, which is that Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, is hospitalized with breakthrough COVID having been vaccinated. Can you explain what that should tell us, if anything?
That should tell us that no vaccine, one, is perfect. And even 2 doses of Pfizer and Moderna are not going to be a perfect 100% protective shield, number one, regardless of your age. But that if you're over 65, which is in the case of the Reverend, he's over 65 years of age, that the vaccines do lose their protectiveness over time. So for the Reverend Jackson and his wife, they definitely need that third shot. And I believe they had yet to get the third shot because this is just in the process of getting approved. So if you're high risk, as defined by having a high risk medical condition like cancer or on steroids for another condition, for 65 of years of age or older, 2 doses does appear to be sufficient for a certain period of time, 8 months, but you do need that third shot. That's what that tells me, Jessica, that the real world data of those that are ending up in the hospital with vaccine breakthrough illness, 80% of those, and it's a really small group when you think about the number of people vaccinated writ large, 80% of those people ending up in the hospital are 65 years of age and older or have a high risk medical condition. So the data is reassuring. If anything, it buttresses that we should be giving booster shots to certain people, but not to everybody.
Got it. That's really helpful. I hadn't really heard it explained that way. Let's switch to school because I have a lot of parents asking about sending their kids back to school. What is the safest way to have, especially your unvaccinated little ones, regularly in class right now?
I would say very clearly that if you're, we can talk about what a high quality mask is for kiddos. My wife, who's a pediatrician, and I purchased something called Happy Masks. No financial conflicts of interest. We just like the mask.
Happy,
There's a
HAPPI? Why?
HAPPY masks, and
Okay.
they have supply issues at the moment, or pediatric versions of a KN95 mask. Again, comfortable, but high filtration quality. High quality masking that's comfortable, that allow your kids to still talk and engage. Really important, because then they're going to wear it. Number one. Number two, if masks are not mandated by the school district, that's not okay. Two, if there's not basic common sense, low cost ventilation improvements, whether it's HEPA filters, there are other low cost innovations that even an inner city public school district could employ at the individual classroom level. If those are not being talked about when you as a parent are engaging with an administrator or principal, that is also not okay. There's been enough time here, and a lot of these innovations are cheap and cost effective. And then lastly, mandatory vaccinations for teachers and staff and eligible students. If you're not hearing across the board those types of procedures, mandatory masks, mandatory vaccinations for those that are eligible, and some basic common sense improvements to ventilation, then you should not feel safe as a parent for sending your kid into school, and nor would I recommend that. Here in Washington State, all the things I mentioned are being put into place, as they are in many parts of the country. If you're a parent in Florida, Jessica, what I'll say is rise up, as some school district parents are doing, as some school district boards are doing. They're saying they're directly opposing what the governor is putting out there. And I think that's the right decision, because there's no middle way here.
I also have a lot of teachers who follow this, and they're concerned about, frankly, their own health. You know, they're the ones who are exposed day in and day out, in some cases, to unvaccinated kids. What would you advise they do? Is it any different from what you said the parents should do? And is there a good source for what are some of the low-cost interventions?
Absolutely, and I can. There's low-cost ventilation options where you're literally creating a air filtration box in a room, making sort of a do-it-your-own air filter. If a HEPA filter, which can cost thousands of dollars, as portable HEPA filters often are beyond the scope of a public school district, especially. And I can certainly share those with you offline, Jessica, if we can socialize those. What I'd say for teachers out there is, you need to feel confident that every adult staff and any child 12 and up is fully vaccinated. And if that's not the case, and I mean, American Federation of Teachers and others have really been very clear here. There's no shades of gray. Teachers should be have the expectation of being mandatorily vaccinated. If you are a teacher that's expected to be an in-person school for 5 days a week, and that's not the case, and I recognize that this is not the case everywhere, what can you do to stay safe? A KN95 mask is the way I would recommend you proceeding. An N95 mask is really tight. It's hard to wear. I do it in the ICU because of my exposure risk is very high. For teachers, a KN95 mask is better than a 3-ply surgical mask. It's not as uncomfortable as an N95, but gives you nearly the same benefits. Highly recommend that. I would also recommend that, especially if you live in a multi-generational household, or if you're a teacher coming back to young kiddos back at home, to get yourself a rapid test and to test yourself once a week with something like the $5 Binax now that's available at a CVS or Walgreens. That combination, risk is never going to be zero, but that's as close as you can get to mitigating risk.
I will say I wear a KN95 and I find it the most comfortable mask. And they're kind of chic looking too. And I have rapid tests at home. I got them. I started doing it. It gives you a real sense of comfort and confidence making choices about your risk and exposure. It's a great thing to do and easy.
And I think the challenge here, what if the government really one of the things that has been upsetting to me has been saying that we'll talk about masks, Jessica, but we won't talk about what specific type of masks. We're talking about KN95 masks, but that's not something that you actually heard from a leading health official. What about children? I'm talking to you about happy masks. But where is the list of masks that have been vetted or approved by some sort of overarching federal agency? To me, that seems like basic types of regulatory guidance that we should be providing parents, perhaps even subsidizing the cost of some of these masks, much less getting tests on your own. I mean, these things add up. So there is a financial burden and a burden on parents and families to get this information when this should be fed to us. We need more than just mask up. We need actual clear guidance on what mask to buy and where to buy it.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's been sort of one of the themes of this pandemic is we're not getting enough clarity from our leadership. And so the decision is shifted to us in areas we have no authority in. And so it becomes very stressful for people to make these decisions. It's really helpful to have the detail from you. Can we talk a little bit about Delta? Because now everybody's an expert in all the variants in the whole Greek alphabet. So first, we're obviously seeing more breakthrough transmission. Is Delta more transmissible outdoors than prior variants? And I'm being asked, should we think about masking outdoors?
What we're seeing, and I mean, we can look at, for example, some of the major concerts that Chicago, Lollapalooza is top of mind, but there's a lot of people screaming and yelling in close quarters unmasked, especially, of course, this was just a few weeks ago when Delta was on the rise. Did we see any substantial case transmission? We did. There was a few cases that were detected, but nothing in terms of an epidemic, certainly. This is what I would recommend. I think the jury is out about whether or not Delta can more easily transmit in an outdoor environment that's crowded. Certainly, we do know that if you're positive for the Delta variant, the likelihood that you have a lot of virus in your nose and your mouth appears to be higher than if you were infected with one of the original variants. So what's practical, actionable guidance for you? If you're in a large crowd, if you're at a concert, if you're in a grocery store, if you're on a plane, that's when I do believe KN95 mask makes sense. I now KN95 anywhere in a crowd where I don't reliably know what the next person or what the person next to me has done in terms of choices. Outside of that, if you're walking in a park, if you're distanced from others, if you're amongst friends who you trust in your backyard, I think you can still go unmasked because, Jessica, it comes down to the end point here of what does success look like? Where are we going to be in a few months? What are we headed towards? And that has not been articulated by the CDC director, or frankly, by Dr. Fauci, both of individuals I deeply respect and I trained under. And yet I think one of their fatal messaging flaws has been, what's success look like? We're not going to head towards eradication. We're probably not going to head towards a point where maybe if you and I are in a backyard together, there's a chance we might be spreading Delta or another version of the variant between each other, but that's okay if it's not causing us to get seriously ill. And that's the paradigm that I think Americans really need to recognize here, is that eradication is not possible with a highly contagious respiratory virus. Case transmission is going to continue. The key piece here is our hospitalization is going to plateau and ultimately get down to a manageable level in most parts of the country. They already are in a lot of parts of the country. We're just overly focusing on places where they're not well controlled. But that this notion here that we're going to eradicate Delta, that we're focusing on cases, that's the wrong end outcome. We have to learn that it's going to be endemic, that there's COVID that you get if you're vaccinated, and there's COVID that you get if you're unvaccinated. But that paradigm, to me, needs to be more clear to more people so that we can start to do more things like engaging in outdoor crowds without having to KN95.
Such an interesting perspective. This is when people say we're going to have to learn to live with this. This is what you're talking about, is there's a COVID you get when you're unvaccinated. I also hear from people who are very worried about breakthrough because they know, everybody knows a friend who got very sick, not hospitalized, but it was, a 3-week bummer, and they're worried about long COVID. What would you say to that and to the concerns about just getting it at all? And do we know if breakthrough cases can lead to long COVID?
They can. It appears to be rare, but it does appear that you could be fully vaccinated, not end up in the hospital, but test positive, and then potentially have long-term symptoms. And that appears to be extremely rare, but possible. What I would say to everybody here is that, and as somebody that actively participates in media, like you, that I think the media has done, at least a lot of the cable networks that I've seen, including my own, tend to give oxygen to anecdotes and have done a disservice to the people, in my view. And I don't like it, because all it's done is it's given a lot of anxiety to something that, yes, it exists. Vaccine breakthrough illness is a possibility, leading to long COVID, or in some rare cases to the hospital. But we're talking about risks, Jessica, that are 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million. If you to end up in the hospital, if you're fully vaccinated, otherwise healthy, with the Delta variant, that risk we believe is on the order of 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million. So less than the risk of getting struck by lightning, of ending up in the hospital with everyday flu, of getting into a car accident. So, I mean, this to me comes down to the question of risk tolerance, recognizing risk will never be zero, but that risk is exceptionally mitigated. And we at some point have to stop making decisions about boosters and about how we live our life based on such a small infinitesimal risk. Is it present? Yes, but it's really small.
Let's talk about the future and what's to come. When I told people you're coming, I got a ton of questions. What do we know about Lambda, Epsilon, Delta Plus, blah? Everybody's got the whole alphabet down. Can you just give us a big picture sense? What could we be facing this fall? And what does our immediate or near-term future look like?
There's 2 schools of thought, Jessica. One is that there's going to be a variant that arises in a part of the world that has no access to vaccine. By the way, 80% plus of the world has zero access to vaccine, that will render the existing vaccines useless. There's another school of thought that I subscribe to, that at a biological level, when you look at the ways in which the Delta variant has changed a key portion of the coronavirus structure, sort of the outer portion of the coronavirus that can anchor onto our lung cells and cause infection, that there's a really small part of it that actually allows it to anchor onto it. It's called the spike protein. And that has changed so much that a lot of scientists think it can't change all that much more, that there are guardrails on how much additional mutations can occur in that key part of the virus. What is that? Why is that important? Because if it can't change morphologically all that much, the antibodies produced from the virus, from the vaccines that still exist today, will remain really effective, even if a variant arises that's slightly different from Delta. And that's a really good thing, because the likelihood then of a variant arising that's going to render the existing vaccines useless is extremely low. Is it possible? Sure. Just like vaccine breakthrough illness causing long COVID is possible. Is it likely? No, it's not likely. So it's a really good thing. Where are we headed? I think this pandemic likely will be in the US's rearview mirror in terms of every 3-month surges by end of winter, beginning of spring 2022. So we have in the next 5 to 6 months of needing to hear about the Delta variant and of COVID and of fluctuations and hospitalization surges in parts of the country, not everywhere, but parts of the country. What worries me for all the parents out there is until we get there, we have to get through cold and flu season. And the problem there, Jessica, is it's not just about COVID anymore. It's about flu, and it's about respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, which is a virus that tends to affect young kids. And what we're seeing is that young kids are filling up hospitals, not with the Delta variant, but with RSV in July, when typically that happens in December, January. And so right around the time we expect the Delta variant hopefully to plateau, and beginning of December, end of or early January, that's when flu and RSV we worry might be taking off based on what we're seeing now here in July, August. And so that's why I think we need to make sure we're aware that there are a lot of non-COVID threats out there. I suspect people, even if your kids have access to vaccines, say in the next few months, I would recommend all the parents out there to keep their kids masked through the end of cold and flu season, so that while exposure will occur, no doubt, kids will take their masks off. It will be mitigated exposure, so we can let their immune systems rev up again and relearn what flu looks like, what RSV looks like.
Two more questions. One is, I'm hearing from some members of the audience about, I'm going to mangle how you pronounce this, Ivermectin, which is, I think, a deworming treatment for horses. You can tell us. I know it's been disproven. The studies it's based on were retracted, but I'm talking to so many people who are convinced that they know someone this helped. And at the same time, I'm hearing reports that people are taking these pills and getting hospitalized because of the pill, not from COVID. Can you tell us, what is this ivermectin and why shouldn't people take it?
Thanks for raising that, Jessica. So ivermectin is, as you say, it's an anti-parasitic drug. So it's something that you give animals or even pets like dogs at home. You give it to them if they look like they're having diarrhea, frankly, from a tapeworm in their gut, just to be blunt about the purpose of it. So it's pretty raw, the reasons for it, and they're pretty constrained. These are veterinary type drugs. Sometimes humans get them if they happen to have tapeworms, but those indications generally are for people that live near the equator. Rarely is ivermectin utilized for humans in the United States because these types of tapeworms don't tend to affect humans often. I'm not saying it isn't possible, but often in the US. Why is this a big deal in studying COVID? Well, some people have studied, does this drug in any way kill or neutralize COVID-19 in studies, in Petri dish studies. And they found out that in Petri dish studies, when you're actually putting the coronavirus in next to ivermectin in a Petri dish, it kills it off. And so now people have made the judgment, well, then why not try it in the human body? And so now people are doing that. The problem here, Jessica, is that the dose that one would need of ivermectin to kill coronavirus in the body is in some cases 600 times higher than the dose that's being utilized in the Petri dish. And so that's why these people are coming in with liver injury, kidney injury, and they're dying in some cases as a result of toxic levels of exposure to ivermectin without any clear proof that this drug works inside the body. What happens in a Petri dish does not necessarily apply to what happens in the body. So number one, there's no proof in a randomized controlled trial that ivermectin is actually beneficial to those with COVID. And number two, it's really darn toxic at the doses we think you might need for it to show any benefit. So that's why for all of you out there, please do not take ivermectin. I have personally cared for people who come in with liver injury who thought ivermectin was a good idea because their doc told them it was. There's a lot of doctors out there, frankly, that need to be held accountable in the US and elsewhere for blindly prescribing something that has no NIH oversight, no FDA guidance, and no randomized clinical control, no randomized control trial data behind it. It is irresponsible that people are doing this because people are harming themselves on the advice of other doctors.
God, that's clear. Thank you. I will post that separately and repeatedly. I want to ask you finally about why we need to take the vaccine. I want to frame it by saying that I, as a person personally, see a naturopath. I see Western doctors, and I'm telling my audience this, I see some Eastern doctors. I believe that sometimes there are other ways to treat certain things or to seek other answers. I think there are a lot of people in this audience who believe that those things are either or, and that the people who are standing by the vaccine are deaf to natural solutions. Is it possible to embrace like the fullness of what science and natural medicine can offer where it's helpful and still take the vaccine?
I don't see why not. I've personally seen, and for example, this reminds me that question reminds me of some of the conversations I've had with professional athletes who are some of the healthiest, most incredible athletes in the world. And I'm thinking of football players, for example, for the NFL. These are individuals who subscribe to healthy living, vitamins, other naturopathic remedies, don't ever want to see a pulmonologist like myself, never planned on it. And yet we talk about the purpose of vaccination. And the key point that they need to be reminded of based on storytelling, and this is where I think storytelling has been underutilized, Jessica, is I've seen CrossFitters, I've seen other athletes who've done everything right and lived the most pure lifestyle. Their immune systems probably are as healthy as one could imagine. And yet they end up in intensive care as a result of the Delta variant. This has been happening since the end of March of 2021. And it's just unlearning or retraining our assumptions. We spent the first 15 months of the pandemic telling everybody it was grandma and grandpa that was going to end up in the ICU, not you, if you're otherwise healthy, doing all the right things. Things pivoted middle of spring, and now it's a very different conversation. So I think it's important to recognize that natural living, whatever you subscribe to ensure that end outcome, that is great, but it's not going to protect you from the Delta variant. And that's been seen time and again here. And I do think threat perception and making it as blunt as possible. I'm, again, as a pulmonologist, leaning on tactics we use for the anti-smoking campaign. I like to show what patients with approvals, of course, what a lung that with COVID looks like, what a lung without COVID looks like. And I think the more you realize that and you convey that people are vulnerable regardless of their lifestyle, then the more you're likely to reach those that have yet to be reachable. But it is really important to recognize here that this is not mutually exclusive, that embracing a vaccine does not in any way co-opt or pollute one's dedication if they are a naturopath to that way of thinking and that philosophy.
Dr. Gupta, you are phenomenal. I am so grateful for your, not just your base of knowledge and your ability to communicate it so clearly. So thank you for what you've done by sharing your knowledge throughout the pandemic and for this conversation today.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jessica Yellin. If you like this video, please click subscribe, and you can click the bell to get notifications when we post new content. Thanks for watching.